lovely to see you, Cassie and Elle, as well. It's fantastic to be on this panel with you. I'd like to just start by doing something we do here in Australia, which is to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're here on today. So I'm sitting in, as I said, not such a salubrious place, my little garage here, but we're in a garage in Sydney, Australia. On the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd love to acknowledge the First Nations of Australia, the place that I'm on today, as the traditional owners of this land that has never been seceded, and recognise the vast knowledge that our organisation gets from this amazing group of people, both in exclusion but also very much in inclusion. I'd also like to do a shout out to anybody on this call who is First Nations anywhere in the world, including our Australian counterparts. So thank you for being with us today. And thank you so much, Cassie and Elle, for being on this call as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd love to start, rather than me introducing both of you, to have you introduce yourselves. So Cassie, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, so as Manisha mentioned, my name is Cassie, and I'm a user experience designer or a UX designer. Some people call them product designers, there's UI designers, there's a lot of designer words floating around out there, but I guess I fit most with the user experience designer title. I also advise and speak on accessibility and inclusion and universal design. I've worked with the WITH Foundation a lot, and through my work with the WITH Foundation, I advise as well with an organization called Sidebench, who I'm representing here today. They're in Santa Monica, California, or Los Angeles, Santa Monica. So yeah, that's kind of a little bit of a background on me and my accessibility and inclusion experience.
Great. And Elle?
Thanks very much for having me. Huge fan of Cassie and delighted to meet you. And I'm so thankful that everybody is spending a little bit of time with us. It's a little bit like an elevator ride, so we will do our very best, but we should definitely connect with everyone who wants to carry the conversation forward. So my name is Elle Waters. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an accessibility product manager at Adobe. Primarily, I work with the Experience Cloud product teams to ensure that they provide fully inclusive experiences for those who are both creating things as well as for their end customers as well. I've spent about 12 or 13 years, I guess, in accessibility as a main full-time role, and huge fan of talking to people who have lots of questions. So.
Oh, wonderful. And we have lots of questions coming in, or there's lovely dialogue and comments on the chat box as well, so on the chat system. So what I'll do is, as we go, if people have questions, let us know and we'll include them in this conversation as well. We'd love to make this a conversation. So, well, my name is Manisha. So I work for the Centre for Inclusive Design. We are based in Australia, but we do a lot of work here and globally around inclusion and design and how those two fit together. So the three of us were talking earlier today about the topic and this idea of universal design versus inclusive design versus lots of other things. And I think one of the things the three of us said is actually that inclusive design and universal design are not diametrically opposed, but come from the same world, come from the same land. And we came up with a definition, which was really, and we'd love to hear how people feel about this definition, but our definition was that often universal design, I guess, was the parent of inclusive design, that it came first and came out of the built environment movement. So many people would have heard about Ed Roberts and the rolling quads and the birth of the sidewalk movement, and why we have curb cuts around the world, and how universal design was this idea of designing something that everyone could use. And it's something that could be then used not only for people who are edge users, people who design was difficult for, but for everybody. Inclusive design comes from the tech world, then. So saying not just that it's one size fits everybody, but one size fits one person. And a good example of that would be this amazing thing we have called a smartphone. And many people don't have a smartphone yet, but for those of us who do, we all use it really, really differently. And the reason we can all use it really differently is because it's built using inclusive design principles. So if it wasn't for people with carpal tunnel, we wouldn't have had the original code that went into gesture control. If it wasn't for people who struggled to see, we may not have had the voiceover technology that led to things like Siri. So we use it differently, but it's simple and beautiful, and we don't know that, you know, it's got these add-ons. It's not an add-on, it's just how the product works. So this is the definition we came up with at the beginning of this talk, or just before it. So I'd love to hear from both Elle, to start with, how this definition plays with you and how that works with the work that you're actually doing today.
Thank you. So I find it really interesting because we use these terms all the time when we're all really moving towards, I think, some of the same goals. With regards to how universal design plays out versus inclusive design, I think that there's a lot of focus on, understandably, on individuals and how they experience, say, digital content. And if you don't take both of these concepts and really employ them, you risk losing something in that process. So I think universal design, in the way that I work with digital content, really plays out in that there's a lot of established best practices. You don't need to go and talk to individuals to find that keyboard accessibility is probably, and I'll say this, my elevator pitch, the #1 thing that you should focus on first. And that color contrast would be a very fast second after that. But then inclusive design is often really the process of identifying who gets left out in that process. And this may be a solution for 80% of people, but can you give people and empower them to be able to either solve for it themselves based on the features and preferences that you build, or you've done enough user testing to where you've identified a significant need or a gap. So we kind of use them hand in hand, starting with the basis of universal design concepts. There are some basic principles of digital accessibility that are just foundational, and they're shared experiences over dozens of years that people have come together to express that need. Like I said, keyboard accessibility being probably one of the #1 things, and that applies to mobile devices too. And then inclusive design, we do a lot of user research to be able to make sure that we understand the full whole person and individual circumstances, and then sort through those to find a way to meet those needs.
And who are the users that you research with? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So Matt May is the head of inclusion at Adobe, and he has a tremendous team, that does a lot of work. And we do a few different things. One is we have staff with disabilities, but that's a bit like having a power user because they can probably solve for things that others can't. And then we do regular audits and accessibility assessments, and we will do task flow assessments with people with disabilities. But the big the real win is when we do usability studies with people with disabilities. Oftentimes it focuses on specific user groups, so low vision, or people who are blind, or people who have mobility impairments, people who are somewhere identify on the spectrum and are neurodivergent. There's a lot of different groups. And as far as who we test with, it really depends on what the questions are that we're looking to answer and the insights we're looking to gain. So that's like 2 steps in. Ultimately, I saw nothing about us without us. And so we only have a few more minutes, so I feel like pressed to have to say that I think that employment for people with disabilities is ultimately how we win all of this, because you really can't experience diversity unless you're with someone in equal amount of power to influence change.
And given, Elle, that you do have to hop off this call in a few minutes, I'm actually going to shortcut a little bit to, if you had one thing you wanted to talk about or explore with the people on this call today, what would that be?
I think that where we sit right now in this world, it is absolutely critical to involve as many different voices and perspectives and abilities and life experiences as we can within the workforce. So this is one reason why I absolutely love this event. Adobe is hiring because there are champions for inclusion in a lot of organizations, but until it's real for people, they will never really understand what it means day to day to involve all these different perspectives. And so the more diverse in our hiring we are, the more we empower people to literally be those creators. And Adobe has a very strong commitment to involving people in the creation process. And so I'll share some links about some things that I'm thinking of in particular. But really, the biggest thing is, I think, explore a way where your organization can be more diverse in its hiring practices and really lift up and create space for people who might not otherwise get an opportunity to be in there. So non-traditional backgrounds, years in another field, young people who have amazing clarity of vision and when it comes to inclusion. Those are the people that I feel like if we can galvanize together, we can really change the way that this conversation goes from day to day.
Absolutely. Now, Elle, full disclosure, I've worked with Adobe and some of your products, and obviously Matt as well. So I know that you have to leave you've got a hard leave at 1 o'clock. So if you're okay, I'll actually just mention some of the knowledge we have, I guess, from the centre in terms of the work you're doing in your practices as well.
Sure.
So we've been very involved in that toolkit that you've been designing.
Fantastic. I am going to post some links that are a recent blog post by Matt May about workforce inclusion, a wonderful podcast called the Cognitive Bias Podcast by David Dillon Thomas, and he has a lot of friends on, and also some different kinds of fellowships that Adobe's involved with about empowering creators with disabilities. And it's a way, again, of opening up the space so that you're not just hiring people with disabilities, but basically as a community of creators and makers, we should be able to have more voices in that conversation.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for being on this panel.
Thank you, guys.
Bye, Elle. It's good to see you.
It's good to see you as well. I'm posting. Keep talking.
Okay. It's the variability piece as well, isn't it, in terms of how these things work. So if we keep going then, Cassie, we've had a question actually that I think is really interesting from, I guess, what Elle has been saying, and that really is around this idea of how inclusive or how accessible can we get, and this idea that actually we can't do everything for everyone.
Right. So you want to respond to that? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I think something that in particular the differences between universal and inclusive design and their definitions are that, that idea of universal one size fits all, or one size can fit all, is really scary for creators to hear and to think about and try to grasp. Especially as a designer, because you kind of go in and you're like, how am I supposed to encompass everybody in this one thing? And I think that's the benefit of inclusive design as a term and as a compass, because it really only states or kind of stipulates that you're including edge cases and people that maybe aren't always considered, including those things in the process, so that by default and as a result, things will get more accessible and get more usable by different people. And it's not so much one for all, it's something for everyone, which sounds a little more biteable, right? Like it sounds doable and possible in a way that universal design maybe doesn't sound possible for some people. So I think in regards to how much can we do, or how inclusive can something get, I think it's always a process. I think a lot of times, especially as an advisor for organizations, companies will say, we did an audit. Are we accessible now? Like, have we met it? And and the only thing I can say is you've met these criteria on the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines as they're written. Does that mean that nobody in the world is ever going to use your website or product and have a difficulty using it for one reason or another, it maybe even in the situational context, no, like it's a continuum of improvement and almost like a part of your organization more than it is an attribute of whatever you've produced.
Absolutely. And I think it's this thing about there is, we work quite heavily on the WCAG guidelines and accessibility. And one of the things we often say to people is there's a difference between accessibility and usability. And sometimes something can be highly accessible, but not necessarily very usable. And that really we're all on a journey and somebody may be missed out. However, it would be good for you to know who that is and how you're going to work with those people rather than have huge groups missed out that you don't know about. So it's where's your blind spot as well. And I think just on that as well, so we spoke a little bit about inclusion and universal design and how these things play out in companies with Elle. Can you actually speak about that from your perspective as well? So how do you engage in the practice and how does that work for you?
Elle or?
Sorry, I did speak to Elle about that, but I'm speaking to you about it now.
Oh,
just
okay.
in terms of the challenges you face, some of the benefits, how does this play out for you? Sorry, we had to change it up a little bit just because Elle was leaving.
No worries. Yeah, I miss her already, but
Yes.
yeah. So I think I can speak from the aspect of a designer, especially somebody who does user research and makes prototypes and does user tests. So that's kind of where my day-to-day is, and then I think of inclusion within that. So I started out in this practice as a UX designer at Sidebench, and a lot of the process included user testing, user feedback, always leading with user insights to validate ideas, basically, because nobody wants to invest a bunch of money in an idea without knowing that somebody somewhere can use it, wants to use it, and probably will pay for it. But I think how inclusion has to creep into that, or has to really seep into every aspect and component, plays out in a number of ways in the recruiting for said in user research. How do we make sure that our users are representative of who lives in this world with us, right? It's not just the people in our office, because we're already a slice of a very particular slice of society, right? And then even in practice, I think something that I've found, I actually think I learned this partially from listening to Elle speak before too, is user personas are something we use a lot in user research and user testing and product development. I think marketing even uses them as customer personas, so they're a little different. I think one tidbit that I would add is a lot of people think, well, should we make a separate user persona for this user with disabilities, or this user who has a different gender identity, or all these different things? And I think what's more helpful is to build your personas and your idea of who your user is without assuming that they do or do not have a certain disability, or they do or do not identify as a certain minority or subset of society, right? That kind of approach to segmenting users or understanding who your user is, building that cardboard cutout of your user, I found to be more beneficial than kind of pre-segmenting and trying to seek in that way, if that makes sense.
Because a disability is not a target market, right?
Right, exactly. It's a component of how somebody approaches your product and how their built environment impacts their life, but it's not solely the way that we sell, the way that we appeal to them, those kinds of things. Yeah.
A good example of that, I think, that we had recently was we were doing some work with a transport organisation, and they had built an app for buses, and they wanted to make sure that this app worked for people who could not see. And we had one person who said yes and one person who said no, it doesn't work. And the person who said yes said they actually were a lawyer who used a screen reader, and they said, yes, the app works perfectly. The other person was a young person who was a salesperson, but was 23 years old and caught buses all the time. and said, no, this app is rubbish. And we said, well, why? And he said, well, when I'm standing at the bus stop and I'm waiting for my bus, yes, I can hear it. It says my bus is coming, but because my bus is the third bus, I still can't find it. I still have to ask someone which bus is mine. Now, it turned out that the first person who was a lawyer, actually, they used a screen reader, but they never called buses.
Right.
Right? So their understanding of how this app would be used was quite different. I think sometimes personas can be reductivist, right? We go for we have to throw something out when we make a persona. And when we're talking to a human, we're not throwing out the knobbly bits. We're actually focusing on the knobbly bits.
Yeah. I mean, I think that you're totally right about this idea that personas I would say almost always are reductive, because at the end, like, nobody can fit on a piece of paper. And I would be incredibly pressed to try to fit myself on a piece of paper. And that's just myself, not trying to engage with another human and understand them and put them on a piece of paper. So yeah, I think they're useful in some ways, but especially when we think about inclusion, they can be tricky if we put too much merit in them in a way.
Yes. And so how do you find this conversation works when you're sitting in a team or you're working with a team of designers who are short on time, they're short on money, and they go, can we just do it this way?
Yeah. I mean, I think I've worked with a lot of startups, so I know that that's kind of like the name of the game, is just like, get it done. How can we do it faster, cheaper, better, and refine from there? And I think to some extent, yes, there are definitely ways that you can say, you know, we're putting an MVP out there and we want to see how people respond to it. I think there's two things you need to do ahead of that. One, you need to make sure that you're hitting the bare minimum, at least, of you know, web content accessibility guidelines, for one. Like, you know, Elle mentioned the keyboard accessibility, color contrast, things that you know are best practices, things that, you know, universal design, accessible resources have published guidelines, like things that you know for sure you can hit and they are beneficial. And then
so
two,
like the grammar of the book, right? It's
exactly.
Like the grammar. You have to have the grammar right. It doesn't matter what the book is. Yeah.
Exactly. So I think at a bare minimum, investing, knowing that that's part of what an MVP is something that is usable so that you can get feedback. And then second of all, the other thing you need to do is prep for how do we respond to feedback that is related to someone's ability or inability to use our product. And I think as long having that plan ahead of time makes you feel a little more comfortable in putting it out, but it also makes sure that you're not putting something out there that doesn't work for someone and is potentially harmful in that way. Like if he can't find which bus it is, you know, he's having that whole interaction with strangers and everything. And you have to be sure that as an organization, you're committed to hearing that feedback, responding to it, and adapting accordingly. And having that plan ahead of time is a commitment to that in a way. That way you can, you know, you see a lot of developer reviews in the App Store where they say, you know, like, thanks for the feedback, but no thanks, we're not fixing it. And that's never a great way to respond to somebody's feedback. So having that feedback loop and being prepped for it is really important as well.
And if you had to say one thing to the people on this call, you know, that either keeps you up at night so that you think, actually, if we just did this, then what would that be?
I do think it is that mindset shift about, are we accessible or not? Like, and because I think that's the hardest part, or maybe the part that is, I would consider, like, when I speak to organizations or when I talk to a team, especially a team of, you know, developers and designers about accessibility and the guidelines and things, I think the fundamental basis of that is an understanding that it's not a switch. You're not, yes, we're accessible. No, we're not accessible. It's not that simple. And if people can really internalize that and grasp it, I think, one, it frees them from this feeling that, like, they have to meet some standard and pass it on the first time and maintain that forever. And two, it also develops that culture of inclusion and focus on it. So yeah, if there was one thing that I could magically gift everyone, and I know it's a big ideological lift. it's not a nugget that you read a blog post and you're done. But if I
Yes.
could just gift that to everyone's brains, I would, because I think it would so help teams make things that are more inclusive and more thoughtful, if they could get in that mindset as a culture.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we often talk about, just to finish on that, is this idea of how aren't we inclusive? Because actually it's really hard to think about all the ways we are inclusive, but sometimes just saying, who doesn't this work for, is a really easy way of at least exposing that in the team as well. So thank you so much, Cassie. We've also got some great resources coming up on the chat, and I know that on our site we have a whole range of resources, from inclusion cards to conversations, and people are more than happy to put up their inspiration for inclusion there as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And it's been great to see everyone, and I love this whole day. So I'll be hanging around in the chat too.
Absolutely. Oh, and before we forget, Cassie has actually done some really great work that we weren't able to cover around healthcare and big data and AI as well. So check that out. It's on her LinkedIn as well. So I'd highly recommend that people go there and have a look at her work in that area as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great conversation, and lots of great feedback in the chat. Great links too. Appreciate you both. Thank you.
Great. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks.
Absolutely.